you should love and feel good about the person you are now. And that's actually a dubious proposition for a variety of reasons. One is, whatever yourself is not only what you are. Yourself is also what you could become. And so to love yourself properly is not only to love what you are, who you are, whatever that means, but to love who you could become. Now, one of the things I've observed is that it's very demoralizing for the typical young person who's miserable and maladjusted psychologically and socially if you just go to them and say, well, you should feel good about yourself, because they think you're good just the way you are. You're perfect just the way you are. You should accept yourself just the way you are. It's like, well, okay, so what does that say about who I should become? Is that just now off the table because I'm already good enough in every way? So am I done or something? What about who I should become? And then, well, how should I feel good about myself when I don't? Because I'm not getting along with myself. I'm anxious and hopeless and nihilistic and depressed, and I'm not getting along with other people. So how is it that that's all somehow something I should feel good about without being deluded? And these are complicated questions because you don't want to beat yourself with a stick, which might be the opposite of that. So, well, feel bad about yourself. It's like, no, be judicious and merciful with yourself and think that you need to accept yourself in some way, the way a mother accepts a child. But the maternal spirit is not the only spirit that governs the love that a child requires properly. You have the paternal spirit of encouragement as well, which is, well, we need to shelter and protect you and to provide for your security the way you are, but you could be a lot better and should be. And I have faith that you could be, which is the love that I'm delivering to what you're becoming rather than what you are. And so love that you direct towards yourself is partly directed towards that maternal care that's sort of the minimum precondition for basic flourishing, combined with an attitude of encouragement towards the possibilities of your being. And so that's a much more sophisticated so-called self-love, partly because it's the kind of love that envisions you as something that unfolds across time. And it's a much richer conception because it also implies that there's a responsible adventure to your life. You're not all you could be, and there's pain in that. And there's the necessity for a certain amount of judgment about that, and even a certain amount of exclusion, because what you are that is insufficient in some sense should not be allowed to propagate further. But if it's conjoined with encouragement, it's like, yeah, you're in a rough situation there, kiddo, but here's some things about you that are virtuous and good, and they're pretty powerful, actually. And if you just made those more manifest, you could dispense with a lot of this immaturity and misery, and you could expand yourself out into life physically and psychologically, and you could start walking this pathway that makes things better. And the thing is that as soon as you start walking the pathway that makes things better, then things immediately become better because your whole orientation changes. And if you're in a bad place but you're escaping, that's pretty positive, even if it's a bad place. And you might think, well, it's still bad, but it's better. It's like, well, that's a lot better than a bad place that's getting worse. That's for sure, because that's hell. Hell is a bad place that's getting worse. That's for sure. And so if you take the bad place and it's getting better, well, it's already not hell. That's a start. And so this notion of love, we've confused this with the maternal instinct for an infant. It's like, because an infant under 6 months, it's like, well, of course, your attitude towards an infant is you're exactly okay the way you are. But that's not what you do to any child that's older than 6 months. You start laying down some criteria for becoming, for improvement. And some of that improvement, because we can define it, well, there's nothing more perfect than a child, than a baby. It's like, yeah, but that's not true if the baby's 14 years old, right? It's true if the baby's 6 months old and actually a baby. But by 9 months, well, the child is going to start to interact socially. And now there's some principles that the child has to learn to abide by so that social interaction is optimized. You want to take the infant who's entirely dependent and turn them into something that's autonomous and then socially integrated, and then socially integrated in a manner that's moving them towards individual responsibility. And the love is not only love that's devoted to what they are at any point, which is that encompassing maternal love, say, but the love that says, yeah, kid, we're pretty happy you're around, but the new you is going to even be better. And that's encouragement. And that's part of love. It's half of love, that's for sure. And you want to direct that to yourself as well. It's like, you don't want to judge who you are so harshly that you just destroy yourself and everything is cast into the pit. You want to take a look at yourself and say, look, you're a person among persons and you have intrinsic worth and you have your flaws, your sins, your domain of ignorance and inadequacy. But that doesn't mean that you're entirely worthless because of that. You have a base level value. That's intrinsic worth, let's say, that's reflective of the fact that you're made in the divine image. In the most fundamental sense, you have intrinsic worth, and that's due a certain degree of baseline love. But there's the becoming problem. It's like, well, especially when you're young, most of you is still in the becoming phase. And so why wouldn't encouragement be the hallmark of love? It's like, get the hell up, get your act together, adopt some responsibility, put your life together, develop a vision, expand yourself beyond the narrow confines that are causing your misery. And we think you can do it. You could do it. You should do it. The world would be better off if you did it. You'd be doing better if you did it. Everything would work out better. Why would we not work to make everything work out better? And you're the person who could do it. And you tell young people that and they think, oh, no one ever told me that before in that way. And they think, well, maybe I should get my act together. And then they go out and try to get their act together. And they think, well, turned out that worked and I'm less miserable. I could try doing it a little bit on a broader scale. And they try that and they think, wow, people seem a lot happier with me. I have more friends and I'm more popular and I'm a little more physically attractive because I'm standing up a little bit straighter. And then away they go and unfold, man. Be a force for good in the world. And that'll be the adventure of your life.
Aimless is not nothing. Aimless is bad. Nietzsche said if you had a why, you could bear any how.
Most people find the meaning in their life through responsibility.
I believe the fundamental religious truth of the idea that life is suffering. It's suffering because we're mortal and fragile and because we're also subject to malevolence at our own hands and at the hands of others. It's a constant existential problem. And that can make you bitter and can make you hopeless and nihilistic and depressed and anxious and likely to abuse substances of various sorts as a medication or an escape. It can augur you in a very large number of ways. And I'm suggesting to people that there is a way out of that. And the way out is to confront that forthrightly and to adopt responsibility in your own life and to try to make the world a better place, and that it's necessary to do that. And that if you don't do that, that things go badly.
I think the deck is stacked against everyone to some degree because life is very difficult and we all die. But some people do have it harder than others. And all of us have it very hard at some times in our lives. It's like, well, what's the alternative? You take responsibility for that and try to struggle uphill because the alternative makes everything worse.
Find something in your life that's so worthwhile doing that the fact that you're going to suffer is justifiable.
Yeah, life's rough, no doubt about it. And if good luck comes your way, then you should be grateful for it. And if happiness manages to manifest itself, you should be grateful for that too.
So then you might ask yourself, well, what's the best antidote to the discomfort of life? And you might say, well, it's comfort. And I suppose that's what you act out when you swaddle a baby. But a better antidote is something like adventure to excellence. And that's far better antidote to suffering than the mere absence of suffering. So not than the mere absence of suffering. So not to say that the mere absence of suffering, that's not nothing.
I've been a psychotherapist for 20 years. I've seen things you can't imagine, horror shows that you can't fathom, and people who have been hurt in so many ways, so many dimensions. It's like, should they be bitter? Should they be resentful? Should they become violent? These things don't help. They have to struggle uphill despite their excess burden. And it's responsibility, not guilt.
It's the female crucifixion. So, and that's exemplified best in, the best portrayal of that I've seen is Michelangelo's Pieta. It's a statue of Mary, and she has Christ's body on her, as an adult, on her lap, and he's broken and destroyed. And, she's displaying that. That's the bravery of a mother, to allow that to happen. But not only that, to facilitate it. Facilitate it. Away you go, kid. Away you go. Away you go. Well, why? It's dangerous out there. It's like, yeah, no kidding. It's more dangerous here if you stay with me by a lot. So you might lose your body out there in the world, but if you stay here, you lose your soul.
You know, I mean, it's a pretty competitive world. There's lots of competition for young men in particular. There's competition for status and limited resources and for the attention of women. And just because you're nice doesn't necessarily mean that you come out particularly well in those competitions.
So here's the fox pretending to be a doctor, investigating Pinocchio's illness. And he makes some notes, which is all just meaningless scribble, right? It's like white noise. And it doesn't matter that the arguments that he's making are completely incoherent. And it doesn't matter that he actually doesn't know anything. What he's selling is easy to buy. And so Pinocchio buys it. And by the end of the conversation with the fox, he's pretty convinced that he's useless and that he needs a vacation. You know, this is an Oedipal situation as well, which I touched on in the other lecture. I mean, let's imagine that you have a child that is a little on the neurotic side, so high negative emotion, and maybe one that's also a little bit on the sickly side, so has a variety of, let's say, relatively minor ailments, but ailments nonetheless. And so what that means as a parent, we'll say mother for this example, because I want to use the Oedipal example, you have to make a decision all the time about exactly how you're going to treat that child. One decision is, well, you don't have to go to school today because you're not feeling well. It's like, fair enough. But do you make the same decision the next day? And do you make the same decision the next day? And let's imagine that you enable the child to avoid responsibility as a consequence of capitalizing on their illness. Well, then that's not going to be very good for the child. The rule with a sickly child has to be something like, I'm going to push you right to your limit. Because otherwise, how is the person going to figure out what they can do? And if they can't figure out what they can do, then they're not going to be able to make their way in the world at all. And then that gets muddied very badly if you're not exactly sure that you want them to make their way in the world. You know, maybe you're just as happy because you'd be sitting at home alone if your child was there with you. And maybe you'd be just as happy at some level if they never grew up at all, because then they won't leave. And maybe that's because you have a terrible marriage and you're lonesome, you know. Maybe it's an abusive marriage and your husband has chased away all your friends. And so you don't have anything at all. And maybe that's because you didn't stand up for yourself very well, apart from the fact that he was, you know, tyrannical in his central nature. And so then all those little warps and bends in your psyche are going to manifest themselves right in the background of every single one of those decisions. My daughter had a lot of illnesses when she was adolescent, and they were very serious, and it was very difficult to figure out what to do about that, because you couldn't exactly apply normative rules, right? And we always had to figure out, if she was communicating her symptoms to us, how seriously to take those. And the answer was the least amount of serious possible. It's something like that, because we needed to know, and she needed to know, what she could do in spite of the fact that she had problems. And one of the things I really tried to instill in her, and I think it worked, is that you don't ever want to use your illness as an excuse for not doing anything. Not consciously. You know, sometimes you might not know, I'm not feeling well, what can I do? Well, you don't know, right? Because sometimes when you're not feeling well, you can do more than you think, and sometimes you can do less than you think. It's not like it's obvious, but sometimes it's obvious. You know, this little temptation flits through your mind, and you think, well, I don't really want to do what I'm doing today, and I'm not feeling very well, so I don't have to do it. You do that 100 times, then you don't know how sick you are anymore. And then you're in real trouble, because not only are you sick, but you've muddied the waters. And so you have both problems then, is you're actually ill, and you've betrayed yourself by using that as an excuse not to pursue your responsibilities. There's a deep idea in the West too. It's like, pick up your damn suffering and bear it. And try to be a good person so you don't make it worse. Well, that's a truth. Life is suffering. Yes. Well, who wants to admit that? Well, just think about it. Well, so what do you do in the face of that suffering? Try to reduce it. Start with yourself. What good are you? Get yourself together for Christ's sake so that when your father dies, you're not whining away in a corner and you can help plan the funeral and you can stand up solidly so that people can rely on you. That's better. Don't be a damn victim. Of course you're a victim. Jesus, obviously. Put yourself together. And that's the other message of the West. It's like, how do you overcome the suffering of life? And I'm not saying it's only the message of the West. How do you overcome the suffering of life? Is be a better person. That's how you do it. Well, that's hard. It takes responsibility. And I think, if you said to someone, you want to have a meaningful life? Everything you do matters. That's the definition of a meaningful life. But everything you do matters. So you're going to have to carry that with you. Or do you want to just forget about the whole meaning thing and then you don't have any responsibility because who the hell cares? And you can wander through life doing whatever you want, gratifying impulsive desires for how useful that's going to be. And you're stuck in meaninglessness, but you don't have any responsibility. Which one do you want? Well, ask yourself, which one are you pursuing? Get yourself together. Transcend your suffering. See if you can be some kind of hero. Make the suffering in the world less. Well, that's the way forward, as far as I can tell, if there is any way forward.
So I have a friend, he's a really good friend of mine, and I've known him since I was in college, and he's a tough guy. I mean, he grew up in under rather poverty-stricken circumstances in northern Alberta, really on a frontier piece of land, like it had only been broken 50 years before by his father, who was a longshoreman and an ex-military guy. Good guy, right. His father. But this guy grew up and he is tough. He worked in lead smelters and he wandered around Western Canada. He was my roommate when I went to college and is still a good friend of mine. And he ended up working with delinquents. He went into social work, oddly enough, and he ended up working with some of the worst delinquents in Canada. And he's a really good guy and he likes to help people get better. But he isn't naive at all. And then part of the reason that he was good at working with the delinquents was because there were no tricks they could get up to that he couldn't see right through. And that was partly because he had a real integrated shadow. I mean, I'll give you an example of him. So one day, I was living in this town called Grand Prairie, and it was at the height of the oil boom. And so it was a rough town, and there were lots of rough bars in it, and lots of young men in there with plenty of money and they come in for 3 days after being out minus 40 weather, working on the oil rigs, and they were ready to party, man. And we had a party one night in this kind of frat house that I went to college in, and way too many people showed up, and some of them were real troublemakers. And we had a table that was pretty full of beer bottles and vodka bottles and so forth, and one guy just went over and tore the leg off and knocked the table over, and then a bunch of us got together and chased them all out. And this friend of mine, he said, "Oh, they'll be back." And so he went upstairs and he put on some steel-toed cowboy boots. It was just like a bloody Western. He came marching down the stairs. And just as he entered the living room, there was a big knock on the front door. It was these hooligans coming back to cause grief. And he just didn't break stride. He opened the door. He pulled open the door, and there was a guy standing there ready to fight, and he kicked him underneath the chin with his steel-toed cowboy boot, knocked him right over the front porch, and the battle was on. But that was exactly what he was like, And his shadow was integrated. He was a great roommate. He reciprocated everything. I always knew if I bought groceries one week, he'd buy it the next. Like, he was a straight shooter. You could trust him. But he was not naive, man. And that made him able to deal with delinquents and to help them. So that's part of that integration of that shadow.